Britain does lighthouses rather well. White towers against grey seas. Keepers in wool sweaters trimming wicks by candlelight. Brass fixtures polished to a shine. The steady beam sweeping across dark waters, guiding ships safely home. Postcard stuff. But some lighthouses never made it onto postcards. Scattered around these coasts are towers where keepers walked out one night and never came back. Stations where the relief boat arrived to find meals half-eaten and clocks stopped. Rocks where men simply ceased to exist, leaving nothing but questions that have never been answered. I have gone through Northern Lighthouse Board records, Trinity House archives, and testimonies from keepers' descendants to bring you 15 lighthouses where something went terribly wrong. Some of these stories are well documented. Others survive only in whispered fragments passed down through fishing communities. All of them are real. Let us begin with the most famous disappearance in British lighthouse history. A case that has haunted investigators for over a century and still defies explanation. The Flannan Isles lie roughly 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides. 7 small islands of rock and grass, battered by Atlantic storms, home to nothing but seabirds and the remains of an ancient chapel built by Saint Flannan in the 6th century. For centuries, shepherds would bring sheep to graze on the islands during summer months, but they would never stay the night. Local tradition held that spirits haunted that remote place, and sensible men did not linger after dark. In 1895, the Northern Lighthouse Board decided to build a lighthouse on Island Moor, the largest of the 7 islands. Construction took 4 years. George Lawson of Rutherglen completed the work at a cost of £1,899. The tower stood 23 metres tall, visible for 24 nautical miles. On the 7th of December 1899, the light was first lit. The lighthouse required a crew of 4 keepers working in rotation. 3 men would remain on the island, while the 4th enjoyed shore leave on Lewis. In December of 1900, the 3 keepers on duty were James Duckett, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, the first assistant, and Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper brought in to cover for the regular man on leave. James Duckett was an experienced lighthouse man. He had a wife and 4 children waiting for him back home. Louisa was 16, Robert was 13, Annabella was 9, Arthur was just 6 years old. Thomas Marshall was younger, unmarried, survived by his father, brother and sister. Donald MacArthur had a wife and 2 children of his own. On the 15th of December 1900, the steamer Arctur was making passage from Philadelphia to Leith. The captain noted in his log that as they passed the Flannan Isles, the lighthouse was dark. No beam swept the water. In poor weather conditions, this was serious. When the Arctur docked in Leith 3 days later, the captain reported what he had seen to the Northern Lighthouse Board. The relief vessel Hesperus was scheduled to visit onward the 20th of December, but adverse weather prevented her departure from Breskleet. The storm did not break until Boxing Day. At noon on the 26th of December, the Hesperus finally reached Island Moor. Joseph Moore was the relief keeper. He was put ashore alone while the ship waited. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his days. The entrance gate to the compound was closed. The main door was closed. Inside, the beds were unmade. The clock on the kitchen wall had stopped. The table was set for a meal that remained uneaten. A chair had been knocked over and left on its side. The only sign of life was a canary in a cage, still alive, chirping in the silence. Moore returned to the landing stage, pale and shaking. He went back up with the Hesperus' second mate and a seaman. Together they climbed the 160 steps to the top of the tower. The lamp was ready to be lit. The mechanism was in working order. Everything was prepared for normal operation. But of the 3 keepers, there was no trace. The men searched every corner of the island. At the east landing, everything was intact, but the west landing told a different story. A storage box positioned 33 meters above sea level had been smashed open, its contents scattered across the rocks. Iron railings were bent over. The iron railway track that ran down the path had been wrenched out of its concrete foundations. A boulder weighing more than a ton had been moved from its original position. At the top of the cliff, more than 60 meters above the water, turf had been ripped away as far as 10 meters from the edge. And there was another detail that investigators could not explain. 2 sets of oilskins were missing from their hooks, but 1 set remained. Someone had gone outside without their waterproof clothing. In those weather conditions, that seemed inexplicable. The subsequent investigation concluded that the 3 keepers had likely been swept away by a freak wave while attempting to secure equipment at the West Landing, but the official explanation satisfied no one. Why would all 3 men leave the lighthouse unmanned? Standing orders forbade it. Why would 1 man venture out without his oilskins in a December storm? How could a wave reach 60 meters up a cliff face? The newspapers of the era indulged in speculation. Some suggested a sea serpent had carried the men away. Others proposed that they had arranged passage on a ship and started new lives elsewhere. Local fishermen spoke darkly of the phantom of the 7 hunters, a ghost ship said to appear before disasters. Some believed the spirits that had always haunted these islands had finally claimed their victims. No bodies were ever recovered. The death registers for the district of Carloway record all 3 men on the same page. The cause of death is listed as probably drowning. The register entries for Duckett and Marshall include a note written in red ink, disappeared on or about the 15th of December, 1900. The lighthouse was relit and continued operation for decades, but subsequent keepers reported strange experiences. On winter nights when the gales blew hard from the Atlantic, voices could be heard in the wind. Voices calling out the names of the 3 dead men. Travel now to the coast of Pembrokeshire, 20 miles offshore from the southwestern tip of Wales. Here lies a cluster of rocks known as the Smalls. For centuries they were a shipping hazard, notorious for ferocious riptides that claimed countless vessels. In 1777, an unorthodox lighthouse was erected on the largest rock. 9 stout oak pillars were embedded in the reef and secured with molten lead, a 2-story wooden cabin perched on top, accessed by a rope ladder from below. The whole structure swayed and creaked in the almost constant wind. In 1801, the 2 keepers manning this isolated post were Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith. They were known to quarrel. Some accounts suggest they could barely stand to be in the same room together, trapped on a platform smaller than a tennis court, surrounded by raging seas, with only each other for company. The tension must have been unbearable. Then Thomas Griffith died. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Some sources describe it as a freak accident, others suggest illness. What is certain is that Thomas Howell was left alone on the Smalls with his colleague's corpse, and no relief ship was coming. Howell faced a terrible dilemma. If he simply disposed of the body into the sea, the authorities might accuse him of murder. The 2 men's quarrels were well known. How could he prove he had not killed Griffith in a fit of rage? So Howell made a different choice. He kept the body. For a while, he stored the corpse inside the living compartment with him, but as days turned to weeks, decomposition set in. The smell became unbearable. Howell had been a cooper in his younger days, skilled at making barrels. He used this knowledge to construct a makeshift coffin from boards taken from a bulkhead in the dwelling apartment. With enormous effort, he placed Griffith's decaying body inside. Then he dragged the coffin outside and lashed it to the railings of the exterior walkway, just beyond the windows where he lived and worked. A storm closed in. Weeks passed with no rescue possible, and the storm did something terrible. The winds tore at the coffin, breaking it apart, leaving the corpse exposed to the elements. Griffith's arm worked loose and hung out through the broken planks. When the wind blew, that arm seemed to wave, to beckon. Passing ships saw the lighthouse still operating. They saw a figure at the railings, arm raised as if waving. They assumed all was well and continued on their way. They did not realize they were seeing a dead man. By the time rescue finally arrived, Thomas Howell had been alone with that waving corpse for weeks. Some accounts say he was barely recognizable. His hair had turned completely white. He was a broken man who never fully recovered. In consequence of this tragedy, Trinity House changed its regulations. From that point forward, the minimum number of lighthouse keepers per shift was required to be 3. If one died, 2 would remain to support each other and to serve as witnesses. The Smalls Lighthouse tragedy rewrote the rules of the profession. Moving up the eastern coast to Sunderland, we find Souter Lighthouse. Built in 1871, it holds a significant place in engineering history. This was the first lighthouse in the world designed and built specifically to use electric power. The tower still stands today, and is now managed by the National Trust and open to visitors, but visitors report that they are not alone. Souter is considered one of the most haunted lighthouses in Britain. The activity varies considerably. Temperature drops in rooms with no explanation. Objects have been seen floating through the air. Visitors report hearing their names called when no one is there. Some have seen a young girl who vanishes when approached. Census records from 1881 and 1891 show that Isabella Darling, niece of the famous Grace Darling, lived at Souter during those years. Why her spirit might remain is unknown, but staff members have their own experiences. One waitress working at the Lighthouse Cafe reported seeing a man in a lighthouse keeper uniform standing in the doorway. As she watched, he vanished before her eyes. The National Trust does not advertise these stories, but they do not deny them either. The lighthouse keeps its secrets. Off the coast of Anglesey in North Wales stands South Stack Lighthouse, perched on a small island connected to the mainland by a bridge over a deep chasm. The views are spectacular. Thousands of seabirds nest on the cliffs each spring. Tour buses bring visitors from across Britain, but locals know about Jack Jones. Jack Jones was a lighthouse keeper at South Stack in the 19th century. The circumstances of his death are not recorded in detail. What is recorded are the experiences of those who came after. Keepers reported hearing knocking on the door at night when no one was outside, tapping on the windows when the nearest human was on the mainland. The sounds of footsteps climbing the spiral stairs when the tower was empty. According to local historian Ian Jones, South Stack was a cheerful posting until the night of the 25th of October, 1853. That night, one of the worst storms ever recorded struck the Welsh coastline. Winds exceeded 100 miles per hour. 200 ships were wrecked along the coast, including the famous Royal Charter. The death toll was staggering. The keepers at South Stack survived, but something changed. The atmosphere in the lighthouse was never quite the same. Some say the spirits of those who died that night still gather near the light that could not save them. At the end of a long, narrow spit of sand, stretching into the Humber estuary, stands Spurn Lighthouse, isolated, windswept, battered by the sea. Lighthouses have stood on Spurn Point since the 15th century, warning ships away from the dangerous shifting sands. The current black and white brick tower was built in 1895. For almost a century, it guided vessels into the Humber before being decommissioned in 1985. The lighthouse is dark now, but visitors say the tower is not empty. People describe flickering lights in the windows, as if a lantern is still burning inside. Others speak of shadows moving across the walls. The figure of a man has been glimpsed on the spiral stair, gone before anyone can reach him. Unexplained noises echo through the building. Footsteps on the metal stairs. Bangs from the lantern room when the door is locked and the building empty. Some report ghostly voices carried on the wind, mixed with the cries of seabirds and the crash of waves. Local folklore suggests these are the spirits of long-dead keepers, still bound to their lonely post at the end of the spit, still keeping watch over ships that no longer need their guidance. The profession of lighthouse keeping was never safe. The isolation alone broke men, but some lighthouses claimed their keepers in ways that defied reason. Eddystone Lighthouse stands on a reef 14 miles south of Plymouth. The rocks there have been wrecking ships for as long as men have sailed these waters. In the 1690s, an eccentric engineer named Henry Winstanley decided to build a lighthouse on this impossible location. Winstanley was a showman as much as an engineer. He had designed mechanical wonders for the court of King Charles II. His lighthouse was equally theatrical. A wooden octagonal structure adorned with galleries, balconies, and ornamental ironwork. Critics said it could never survive the Atlantic storms. Winstanley replied that he wished to be inside the lighthouse during the greatest storm there ever was. On the night of the 27th of November, 1703, he got his wish. The Great Storm of 1703 was the most ferocious weather event ever recorded on the British Isles. Winds reached 118 miles per hour. Buildings across England were destroyed. Entire fleets were smashed in harbour. Thousands died at sea and on land. Henry Winstanley had travelled to Eddystone to make repairs. He was inside his lighthouse when the storm struck. By morning, there was no trace of the structure, no trace of Winstanley. no trace of the 7 other men who had been with him. The lighthouse had been completely erased from the rock, as if it had never existed. A second lighthouse was built on Eddystone in 1709. This one was a wooden tower designed by John Rudyard. It stood for nearly 50 years. Then, on the 2nd of December 1755, disaster struck again. Henry Hall was the keeper on duty that night. He was 94 years old, one of the oldest lighthouse keepers in British history. Around 2 in the morning, he discovered that a spark from the lamp had set the roof alight. Hall immediately began fighting the fire. As he worked, he looked up to check his progress. At that moment, a section of the lead roof gave way. Molten lead poured down onto his body, burning his head, face, neck and shoulders. His mouth was open. The liquid metal went down his throat. Hall later recalled screaming that he was on fire inside. Incredibly, he survived the immediate incident. The fire was eventually contained. Hall was evacuated to the mainland. For 12 days, doctors tried to save him. He complained constantly of pain in his stomach that nothing could relieve. When he finally died, an autopsy was performed. Inside his stomach, surgeons found 200 grams of solid lead. The metal had cooled and hardened inside him. He had lived for nearly 2 weeks with a ball of lead in his gut. The doctor who performed the autopsy, a man named Spry, sent a report to the Royal Society. Few believed him. The idea that a man could swallow molten lead and survive even briefly seemed impossible, but Dr. Spry preserved the evidence. That piece of lead exists to this day. Off the Northumberland coast lie the Flannan Isles, a scattering of rocky outcrops that are home to seals and seabirds in extraordinary numbers. On Longstone Rock in the outer group stands Longstone Lighthouse, completed in 1826. This lighthouse is famous for one of the most celebrated acts of heroism in British maritime history. On the 7th of September 1838, the steamship Forfarshire was making passage from Hull to Dundee when it struck Hawker's Rocks about a mile from the lighthouse. The vessel broke apart. 43 people drowned. But the forward section of the ship remained wedged on the rocks, and survivors clung to the wreckage through the night. At daybreak, the lighthouse keeper, William Darling, saw the wreck. The waves were tremendous. Local fishermen on the mainland thought rescue impossible. Even Darling hesitated, but his daughter, Grace, 22 years old, insisted they must try. Together, father and daughter launched their small boat into the storm. After a desperate struggle against the waves, they reached the wreck and rescued 4 men and 1 woman. Grace Darling became an instant national hero. Medals, portraits, poems and songs celebrated her bravery. Queen Victoria sent a personal gift. But fame came at a cost. Grace was never comfortable with the attention. She fell ill with tuberculosis while visiting the mainland in 1842. Her condition declined rapidly. She was brought back to Bamberg, the place of her birth, where she died in October of that year. She was 26 years old. Grace is buried in the churchyard of St. Aidan's Church in Bamberg. An elaborate monument marks her grave, but some say she never really left Longstone. 2 keepers in the 1970s reported hearing footsteps in the engine room and the tower when no one else was present. They described the sound of a woman walking. The lighthouse became fully automated in 1990. No human keepers have lived there since. Whether Grace Darling still walks the tower, there is no one left to say. Along the Norfolk coast, near the village of Happisburgh, stands Happisburgh Lighthouse. The red and white striped tower is a beloved local landmark, but the surrounding area has a much darker reputation. The Pump Hill Ghost is a well-known spirit that haunts this stretch of coast. He is sometimes seen walking through the village carrying his own severed head in his arms. The headless figure follows a route from the church toward the cliff edge, past the lighthouse, and along the coast to Cart Gap. Local tradition holds that he was a smuggler who fell out with his associates over the division of their illegal cargo. They killed him and took his head to prevent identification. Now, he walks eternally, searching for the rest of himself, passing the lighthouse beam without casting a shadow. At Whitley Bay, near Newcastle, St. Mary's Lighthouse stands on a small tidal island. A causeway connects it to the mainland, but only at low tide. Visitors who time their visit wrong find themselves trapped until the water recedes. The island has a grim history. A medieval chapel once stood here, with a burial ground for monks alongside it. When the lighthouse was built in 1898, the chapel was demolished. Human remains were uncovered during construction of the keeper's cottages. The bones were removed, but perhaps not all the spirits went with them. In 1722, a local customs officer named Anthony Mitchell was investigating smuggling activity in the area. The smugglers caught him. They killed him and dumped his body on the island at a spot now known as Smuggler's Creek. 17 years later, a glassmaker named Michael Curry murdered a pub landlord called Old Hartley. Curry was hanged, and his body was displayed at a location still called Curry's Point, within sight of the lighthouse. Visitors climbing the lighthouse stairs report sudden cold spots that move through the tower. Some feel they are being watched. Others sense a presence following them up the spiral steps. The island is small. The dead have nowhere else to go. On the Somerset coast at Burnham-on-Sea, 2 lighthouses work together to guide ships through the treacherous Bristol Channel. The High Lighthouse was built in 1832. During its construction, one of the workers fell from the tower to his death. His name is not recorded. His grave is unmarked. But on stormy nights, locals claim to hear moaning sounds coming from the lighthouse. Not the wind in the structure. Something more human. Something in pain. The worker fell more than a century and a half ago, but some griefs do not fade with time. At Whitby in North Yorkshire, the harbour is protected by 2 piers that reach out into the North Sea. The town itself is famous for its connection to Bram Stoker's Dracula, the ruined abbey on the cliff top, the 199 steps, the graveyard where Count Dracula first came ashore in the novel. But the lighthouse on the West Pier has its own tale. One stormy night, the keeper temporarily left the tower for reasons unknown. When he looked back over his shoulder, he saw that the light had gone out. He hurried back through the rain, soaked to the skin, and climbed the steps to relight the lantern. Having restored the light, he turned to go back down. He slipped, he fell, he died. Now, on black and blustery nights, a solitary figure is sometimes seen making his way along the pier with a covered lantern in his hand. He walks to the lighthouse door, and then he disappears through the wood and iron as if they were not there, still keeping the light, still doing his duty, unable to stop. On the coast of Flintshire in North Wales, Point of Ayr Lighthouse stands abandoned at the edge of the beach. The White Tower is a popular destination for walkers and photographers, but the lighthouse has a troubled history. Visitors have reported seeing a lighthouse keeper walking across the gallery high above, or looking down from the gallery railing. When they wave, he does not respond. When they look away and look back, he is gone. Records from the late 19th century are incomplete. What is known is that the final keeper died under circumstances that were never fully explained. His body was reportedly found later, but conflicting accounts have muddied the truth. Some versions say he vanished first and was only discovered weeks later. Others say he was found at the base of the cliffs. The isolation of the lighthouse meant few witnesses to daily life there. Official records provide little clarity. What remains is a lighthouse that will not stay empty, a keeper who will not leave his post. On the Moray coast of Scotland, near the village of Lossiemouth, Covesea Lighthouse has guided ships since 1846. The tower is automated now, but the road that passes it is still used. One evening, a driver was travelling west along the coast road near the lighthouse. Ahead of her, walking in the middle of the road, was a woman. Cars were passing on either side, but the woman did not react. She looked straight ahead, as if the vehicles did not exist. The driver was certain the woman would be hit. She slowed, looking for a place to pull over and help. 5 minutes later, driving back the same way, the woman was gone. No sign of her on the road or the verge. No body, no ambulance, nothing. Who she was, no one knows. Why she was walking toward the lighthouse, no one knows. Where she went, no one can say. On the Suffolk coast, at the southern edge of Pakefield, there is a place called Crazy Mary's Hole. Near the disused lighthouse, on the cliff top overlooking the sea, a woman named Mary once kept watch for her husband's ship to return. He never came back. He was lost at sea, his vessel claimed by the waters she watched so carefully. But Mary would not believe it. She continued waiting on the cliffs, day after day, refusing food, refusing shelter, refusing to accept what everyone else already knew. She died there. Starvation and exposure and grief, but her ghost still waits. In 1981, an employee at a local holiday camp saw a figure on the cliffs near the old lighthouse. A woman in old-fashioned clothing, staring out to sea. When he approached, she was not there. Mary is still waiting. After all these years, she has not given up hope. Our final lighthouse stands 11 miles off the coast of Angus, in Scotland. Bell Rock Lighthouse rises from a reef that is submerged at high tide, visible only as a churning of waves over hidden stone. For centuries, the Inchcape Rock claimed ships by the dozen. Mariners called it the deadliest reef in the British Isles. In 1807, an engineer named Robert Stevenson began construction of a lighthouse on this impossible site. The challenges were immense. Workers could only access the reef for a few hours at low tide. Waves swept over the rock without warning. Men worked waist-deep in freezing water, racing against the returning sea. The lighthouse took 4 years to build. The human cost was significant. Multiple workers were killed or injured during construction. The isolation drove men to breaking point. Fights broke out. Some workers refused to return after their first shift. When the lighthouse was completed in 1811, it was hailed as an engineering marvel. 115 feet of granite and sandstone rising from the sea, but the keepers who manned it paid a different price. Bell Rock keepers were stationed on the reef for 6 weeks at a time, 6 weeks with no relief possible if storms prevented the tender from approaching. 6 weeks in a tower so narrow that 3 men could barely pass each other on the stairs. 6 weeks with nothing but the endless ocean. The screaming wind, the crash of waves against stone. Letters from keepers and their families tell of the toll this isolation took. Men returned home changed, jumpy, unable to sleep without the sound of waves, unable to tolerate crowds or noise. Some never readjusted to life on shore. Their families spoke of living with strangers wearing their husbands' faces. The Northern Lighthouse Board automated the last manned Scottish lighthouse in March 1998. The keepers went home. The towers remain. And on winter nights, when the gales blow hard from the North Atlantic, some say you can still hear voices, calling across the water, names shouted into the wind, the sounds of men who spent their lives in service to the light, unable to leave even after death. Britain's lighthouses saved countless lives. They guided ships through fog and storm, past reef and rock, home to harbour. The keepers who manned them sacrificed years of their lives to isolation, monotony, and danger. Some sacrificed everything. The lights are automated now. Computer systems monitor the lamps. Helicopters carry engineers for maintenance visits. No one sleeps in those narrow towers anymore. No one trims the wicks or polishes the brass, or winds the clockwork mechanisms that once turned the great lenses. But the towers remain, standing sentinel on their rocks and headlands, their cliffs and islands, and in each one perhaps something lingers. A footstep on the stair, a shadow on the wall, a figure at the window looking out across dark water, still keeping watch. The next time you see a lighthouse beam sweeping across the night, spare a thought for those who came before. The keepers who lived and died in those white towers, the men who vanished without explanation, the souls who never left. Their lights still burn. And so, it seems, do they.